Please help me welcome Judge John Buttrick.
Thank you. Thank you, and I appreciate the introduction. What were we, about 10 years old then in 1994? My oratorical skills, such as they were, probably deteriorated over the years, so I hope that you don't think that you're going to hear William Jennings Bryan tonight. The title of this presentation that I scratched out when I first had the idea to do this was, it's a little loud. Is that too loud for everybody? No? It's okay? Good. Libertarian Party, complete waste of time or last hope for freedom. And it's sort of a provocative title because it creates sort of a false dichotomy, meaning that the value of the Libertarian Party is either nothing or everything. Spoiler alert, I don't think it's either one, and I think that's the conclusion we'll come to at the end, but I did want to highlight the extreme reactions that people have to the idea of a Libertarian Party and that they've had to it over the years as it's developed. I'm going to hopefully lay out the entire spectrum of both positive and negative attributes of the LP as an organization. And as I said, I'm really not going to reach a conclusion. You're going to reach the conclusion as to whether or not the Libertarian Party is something that's worth your time or effort going forward. I do have a bias based upon my own experiences, which are a little bit unusual. I was very active in the Libertarian Party on a state and national level in the 1990s. As was mentioned, I ran for governor in the state, and I was on the Libertarian National Committee and chaired the National Platform Committee a couple of times, et cetera. And all of that ended when I was appointed to the bench. I served on the state and federal benches for a total of about 15 years, from 2001 to 2016. And during that time, I was completely out of the politics business. I barely watched television during that time period, let alone be active anyway. I think I voted. I did get around to doing that. But judges are pretty much sealed off from ongoing political activism, and so I had no role. So that gives me a sort of a funny perspective, because I had this intense period of activism followed by a hibernation period. And now I can look back at the two of those and hopefully lend some insights. So I've been both deeply embroiled in the Libertarian Party and completely separate from it at different times. By the way, let me sort of generally define some terms here. By libertarianism, I mean generally the individualist political strain of classical liberalism, which is based upon the non-aggression principle and is generally seen as fiscally conservative and socially tolerant, with a strong non-interventionist free trade foreign policy component. That's an American version of libertarianism, not exactly the same at all times and places, certainly not in all countries of the world. But I mean to trace that strain that started with Tucker and Spooner in the 19th century, and then the political ideas of Rand and economics of Mises and Murray Rothbard in particular. Of all those people, the only one that actually embraced the term libertarianism and was actually involved in the Libertarian Party was Rothbard. And who was very active in the early years of the party. Let me give you a little bit of Libertarian Party history for what it's worth. It was formed in 1971 in Colorado. And it's interesting, the issues that triggered the forming of the Libertarian Party at that time. You have to take a little time trip back to 1971. In 1971, we were involved in a war in Vietnam, a war which at that time was while popular among some people, was very unpopular among a subclass of Americans, including a lot of young people. And one of the reasons that they didn't like it very much was they were being drafted to go to Vietnam. This is towards the end of the Vietnam War, but it's been raging for quite some time. The draft had been reinstated and had been in place the entire time, but the draft was somewhat easy to avoid throughout most of the 1960s until a system of a lottery system was imposed in the late 60s, I think around 1968, which meant that all young men, it was men only at that time, were subject to the draft on their 18th birthday and subject completely to the whims of which ping pong ball was pulled out of the tumbler and what their birthday was. This focused a lot of people on the war, more so I think the draft did more to end the war than almost anything else, because it really, entire generation of people felt that they were going to be threatened with the possibility, or their brothers were, or the guy down the street, or everybody they knew was being subject to the draft. The second thing that was happening in the early 1970s, we had inflation. And the president at that time, who was also in favor of the war and in favor of the draft, was in favor of wage and price controls. In fact, attempted to implement them, and that created the predictable chaos of shortages and price fixing and black markets and everything that comes with wage and price controls. And it was a pretty dismal failure. And while it took some time, large numbers of people at that time saw that that was the wrong answer and could never be the right answer to how to set prices in a free society. Those two issues, the war and the draft on one side and wage and price controls, were the two driving issues behind the formation of the Libertarian Party. At least that's what we learned from party history at that time. And it took off pretty fast. In 1972, just a year after the founding of the party, the Libertarian Party had its first presidential candidate, John Hospers, who was a philosophy professor at the University of Southern California. And they were only on the ballot in 2 states at that time. I believe it was Colorado and either Oregon or Washington. Can't remember which. No, not Virginia. We'll get to Virginia in a second. We're not in Virginia yet. I believe it was either Oregon or Washington. Of course, only a few thousand votes were achieved at that time. However, the candidate, Professor Hospers, received an electoral vote because when the Electoral College convened, the Virginia electors, who were, if you remember, 1972 was an overwhelming victory for Richard Nixon against George McGovern. And in the Electoral College, one Virginia elector, a man named Roger McBride, decided he was not going to pledge himself to Nixon and cast his vote for John Hospers. And here's the way to win a lot of money in a bar, by the way. Ready for this bar bet? This one never fails. Who was the first woman ever to get an electoral vote? And after people think about this, particularly if they've been hazed over by some Budweiser, they eventually come up with Geraldine Ferraro as the answer, who was Mondale's vice presidential candidate. And that, of course, is dead wrong, because in 1972, when Roger McBride cast an electoral vote, he cast for John Hospers and his running mate, who was a woman, Tony Nathan, who I believe was from Washington or Oregon, one or the other. Still can't remember that. So that's how you win money in bars, with that bet. And people will challenge you because it sounds so ridiculous, but you'll be right. And they'll be buying you beers for the whole rest of the night. So, joking aside, that got a little bit of publicity for the party. And McBride, in fact, 4 years later, was the Libertarian Party candidate for president. So he sort of got a reward for that. But the growth of the party in terms of state ballot access in presidential elections really took off. And there have been a number of presidential elections where the Libertarian Party has been on the ballot in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. That's not easy to achieve. We'll talk about the obstacles to that. But it has been achieved frequently by the Libertarian Party, including in the last election in 2016. And it shows that there is an ability to mobilize resources, both in terms of people and money, to be able to acquire ballot status, which is not something to be sneezed at. Other third parties in recent years have attempted to do this on an ongoing basis and failed. The Green Party, for instance, which has had candidates like Ralph Nader is fairly well known, et cetera, and other third parties have come up over the years and attempted to get 50 state ballot access, and have failed, whereas the Libertarian Party has been able to accomplish it on a fairly regular basis. If not 50, sometimes 49 or 48 if there's some screw up in a particular state. That achievement has been consistent across the years. The party itself is organized very much sort of on the model of the older parties. I think that's basically because the law, both federal and state laws, push the parties to be organized in essentially a one-size-fits-all sort of regimen. However, some of it is just plain common sense. If you're going to have a national party, you're going to want to have a national chair. The national chair is present, by the way, Mr. Sorrell is sitting right there. That's why he's correcting me every time I say something wrong. You're going to want to have a national committee, and indeed there is such a thing as a Libertarian National Committee. It has conventions. There's a convention coming up in New Orleans in a few months, and every 2 years there's a national convention. People come from various states from all over the country there. They have bylaws, they have platforms, just like the Republicans and Democrats. And they have state party affiliates. And indeed, all the states have affiliate parties, which are organized in conformance with the state law in every state. One significant difference is that members of the Libertarian Party, there's a pledge that is taken if you want to become a member of the National Party, which is separate from being a registered voter, to the effect that Libertarians do not endorse the use of physical force or fraud in order to achieve political or social ends. There's no such pledge in the Republican and Democratic Party for obvious reasons. The candidates, of course, are run in virtually all states where ballot access can be achieved. And this is the first place where the Libertarian structure differs significantly from Republican and Democratic parties, because it's extremely difficult in some states for there to be ballot status for third parties. Many states have very high signature requirements or electoral success requirements for a third party to be even placed on the ballot. Other states have even more sophisticated ways of blocking ballot access. By the way, many of these are subject to legal challenge and have been successfully challenged. Other states have developed, as I say, more sophisticated means of keeping libertarians off the ballot. They do that by allowing the party to have ballot status, but coming up with onerous signature requirements for individual candidates. Arizona is one of the states that has tumbled to this strategy, and in fact the laws here changed fairly recently that make it very difficult for, although the party has ballot status, for individual candidates to get on the ballot. A lot of time and effort has to be taken up getting signatures of registered libertarians or independents to be able to get onto the ballot. That is why when you go to vote in November, you may be disappointed because it may not be libertarian candidates for all of the races that you're interested in. That's not always because of lack of interest by the party or lack of interest by candidates. It's because our friends in the state legislature have determined to block that. And they've been somewhat successful. Again, in Arizona as elsewhere, there are lawsuits pending to try to undo that. Electoral accomplishments over the years. Well, ballot status, as I mentioned. Occasionally at the state level, there have been state representatives or legislators elected, I think in Alaska and New Hampshire, the two states that I could recall where there have been actual electoral victories. Very hard to come by in three-way races, sometimes nonpartisan races, or people running for dog catcher or city councilman or whatever have often been elected who are libertarians, but not with an L next to their name on the ballot. That's very difficult to do. No members of the United States Congress either representatives or senators, of course, time from 1972. Presidential candidates have not fared any better. There's been no Libertarian president that I'm aware of. In fact, for many years, the Libertarian candidate for president, while achieving ballot status, as I mentioned before, in virtually all states, has achieved something less than 1% of the votes, sometimes 0.5% or 2/3% of the total votes cast. Now, there are three notable exceptions to that historically. One was in 1980, where Ed Clark from California ran for president on the Libertarian ticket and achieved about 1% of the total votes cast. The reason for that, I think is pretty well accepted, had to do with his vice presidential candidate, a fellow by the name of Koch, one of the Koch brothers, who donated about $1 million, I think, to his own campaign. And you might think, $1 million, what's that? That's nothing, because they're running billion-dollar campaigns now. What's $1 million? In 1980, $1 million was real money. It bought national television ads, like on NBC and CBS for 30 seconds or a minute at a time. And that attracted a lot of attention. It was relatively well organized for libertarians. It was a well organized campaign. And it achieved at that time, record vote total. After that, the money from the Kochs dried up, and the vote totals went back down. The other two exceptions, however, happened in 2012 and 2016. 2012, Gary Johnson, former Republican and former governor, two-term governor from New Hampshire, was a Libertarian.
New Mexico.
Did I say New Hampshire?
Same thing.
Wow, yeah. Not New Hampshire, not New York, not New Jersey, but New Mexico was the Libertarian Party nominee. And for the first time, I think he exceeded 1 million votes and had approximately 1% of the total votes cast. And that, I think, gets chalked up to a better than average candidate, which I think that Governor Johnson was, and a good organization, and perhaps some growth in libertarian ideas. And the word libertarian perhaps was losing some of its earlier negative connotation. That's just my guess. That's my personal opinion. But the real story came 4 years later, in 2016. Because just like a biology experiment, we nominated the same person over again and see whether we get different results this time. And Gary Johnson is once again the nominee, but this time his vote total quadrupled to over 4 million votes. And the total percentage was something in the neighborhood of 4% also. Now, how would the same candidate, that's the first time in American history, the same candidate running 2 times in a row, quadruple their vote total the second time around? How could that be? It wasn't because Gary Johnson was quadrupled his charisma quotient. It wasn't because there were a lot of changes in the message of the Libertarian Party. It wasn't because there was an enormous influx of money from a billionaire. It wasn't because he got 4 times better publicity from the media. This again is my personal opinion. I think it had to do with his competition. In 2016, the Republicans and Democrats saw fit to nominate Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And I don't know about you, but I ran into an awful lot of people in 2016 who were saying things like, I always hear this, but more than normal, I was hearing, what an awful choice. I don't know which of these people to vote for. I don't like either one. Did you hear that last year? Yeah, we all heard that. We hear, as I say, there's always that undercurrent of dissatisfaction among the electorate that you hear quite frequently. In 2016, I think, was pretty rampant. This is sort of the missed story of the 2016 election. The mainstream media seems not to have really picked up on this or emphasized this, and the talking heads you see on TV that analyze this election seldom refer to this phenomenon. But there's no other explanation, I think, for the fact that third parties in total got over 5% of the vote in the 2016 election. An enormous jump And there were no celebrity candidates. There was no Ross Perot with billions of dollars. So there was no Teddy Roosevelt, former president, running. It was same old Gary Johnson from 4 years before. And yet you had this big jump. I'll come back to that phenomenon later because I think that tells us something about the future. But that was by far the most successful presidential campaign for a Libertarian Party candidate. Now, who are these Libertarian voters? Well, they're not just registered Libertarians. I think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 350,000 registered Libertarian voters in the United States. It's hard to quantify that because many states don't allow, not many, but quite a few states do not allow registration by party. It's not all like Arizona where you register Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, or no preference. Some states you're not allowed to do that. So we don't know how many Libertarians there are. And it's not measured by members of the National Party. National Party membership is something that you get a plunk down $25 or something like that. That's what it is these days, $25 to be a member. And a lot of people, for better or worse, decide I can live my life without being a member of the National Party. And I'll still vote Libertarian or a registered Libertarian or whatever. And there are many, many people all over the country that way. I think there's only about 16,000 of the National Party members. So, but that doesn't come anywhere close to the number of people who are voting for Libertarian candidates. I mentioned Johnson's 4 million votes. Also down ticket, there are many tens of millions of other votes being cast for Libertarian candidates all across the country on an ongoing basis. So there are people out there who go into the voting booth and vote Libertarian constantly, who have not registered and are not on some mailing list and don't go to national conventions or whatever. That's important to keep in mind because that's a strong basis that can be used for growth for the future. Of course, political parties primarily exist for elections, to elect people, but they also can have non-electoral effects. Here, I think, in terms of the Libertarian Party, that effect has been relatively minimal over time. There are very few joint efforts with other libertarians, small libertarian entities that have had significant impact in joining with the Libertarian Party. Now, part of that is because the laws don't favor this. There are a lot of libertarian movements and entities in the libertarian movement. Many of you may be familiar with educational entities, think tanks, all sorts of, we can all name them, our favorite ones that we give money to or whatever. They may be emphasizing broad-based policy. They may be emphasizing economics. They may have particular issues like the drug war or whatever that they're interested in. Most of these have shelter under the tax law under 501c3, which forbids them from endorsing or working with partisan political entities. So you don't see, for instance, the Cato Institute endorsing candidates, or the Goldwater Institute endorsing candidates. So in fact, there has to be sort of a wall there between political parties and these entities. You don't see that kind of cross-pollination. That makes it more difficult. Also, there's not much in the way of PAC money. You notice that when the Republicans and Democrats are broadly funded by all sorts of entities, the PAC for United Americans for Good Government PAC, or the Utopia Tomorrow PAC or whatever. And nobody even knows, by reading the name of the PACs, you don't even know who are these people supporting? Who are they? What are their principles? You have to dig a little bit to find out. Well, you don't have to dig too much, you just Google it. And what you end up with is that these are highly partisan entities formed to try to get around campaign financing laws, which they do successfully and legally, to take in money to use on campaigns, to not endorse, but to affect the outcome of political campaigns. And there's been more and more of that money collected over the last 10 years ago or so that now the sort of tail wags the dog almost in some of these races where the outside money is in fact affecting more outside money is being spent than spent by the actual campaigns of these various candidates. Very little of any of that has happened with Libertarian Party candidates. I'm sure there is, Nick will correct me, I'm sure there are libertarian PACs out there. But the amount of money and influence wielded by those entities is minimal compared to the ones that support the candidacies of Republicans and Democrats. Well, the first prong of my talk, the first part of the dichotomy is that the Libertarian Party is a waste of time. And I do hear this. I hear this occasionally. And the people who make that argument have several vectors, several ways that they wage this, support this argument. The first is that the Libertarian Party siphons off limited resources. They argue that people have limited time, money, and energy to give to political activism, and supporting the Libertarian Party never brings about any real change because nobody gets elected, and therefore what you've done is by spending your time, money, and energy on the Libertarian Party, you have wasted it when you could have been doing whatever it is the critic wants you to do, something differently, supporting a different libertarian entity, writing a book, infiltrating one of the old parties, whatever their theory is, that you could have used your time better doing that, or becoming issue-oriented or supporting a think tank. You've wasted the time by indulging in political party activities. The second argument that they make, which is somewhat a corollary, is that the Libertarian Party doesn't win elections, has not won elections, is not now winning elections, and never will win elections. And they support that with a little bit of history, some of the history that I've already laid out for you. But they also say that there are insuperable obstacles. The first obstacle is ballot access. As I mentioned, the party has actually done very well in terms of getting ballot access over the years, but it is an ongoing process. It's not as if, in most states, you simply snap your fingers, you get ballot access, you say, whew, okay, now I'm good to the next century. And that's not like that at all. In many of these states, you have to requalify every 2 years or every 4 years, etc. Some states, it's dependent upon electoral results. You have to get a certain percentage of the total vote cast in order to requalify. In other states, you're starting from fresh each time, or the bar keeps changing. You know, we thought you had to get 15,000 signatures. No, we didn't mean that. It's 25,000, etc. So, in order to, and the party does a very good job of tracking this and keeping track. Some of the best ballot access experts in the country are affiliated with the Libertarian Party. That's a fact. This is a strong point of the party because they spent so many years, so much money, and so much effort to achieve this that they've become experts in the field. So my hat is off to that. But it's true that it does take an ongoing effort, and the forces of evil are always pushing back, always trying to make it more difficult. And the guardian, so to speak, of this, the eventual referee as to whether or not you get on the ballot, are judges and courts. And judges and courts are notoriously unreliable because they can change their minds from time to time, or just become totally irrational, or not. And it's very difficult to rely upon that. So that means that this obstacle of getting people on the ballot is not only here now, it's going to continue. And so, as I mentioned earlier, in November, if you're in Arizona and you go to vote, there may be a number of important races that you will not see a Libertarian candidate. Well, say the critics, see what I mean? They can't even field candidates for these positions. And ballot access is the number one problem there. The second problem is that we have this, what's sometimes called Firstpastthepost or winner-take-all single-member districts. What am I talking about? What I'm talking about is something that was passed on to us by our former masters from Great Britain. The British Empire, or any country that's ever been in the British Empire, uses first-past-the-post type of electoral systems. And what does that mean? That means that you have a single-member district, whoever gets the most votes win, winner take all. The rest of the world, if you go to Japan, you go to Israel, you go to Germany, none of whom have ever been part of the British Empire as far as I can recall, they have proportional representation of one form or another. So if there are 100 seats in their Senate, let's say, and a minor party gets 10% of the vote, guess what? They probably get 10 seats, or some formula that approximates that. We don't have anything like that in this country, by and large. There are a few isolated exceptions. That is a tremendous barrier to third parties. Imagine what life would be like if the United States House of Representatives, which has 435 members, I think, had, let's just say 3% libertarians. It's a puny little 3%. What is that? That's 12 people. There'd be 12 libertarian congressmen in the Senate. Do you think they would raise hell? I think they would. What about our state legislature here in Arizona? We've got 90 members of the state legislature. They're all Republicans and Democrats. Not a single third party, not even an independent. And in Arizona, independents are a bigger block than either Republicans or Democrats in terms of registered voters right now. No independents in the state legislature. So this first-past-the-post system, which shows no sign of changing in the United States, is a tremendous obstacle to third parties. And finally, the worst of the obstacles is the wasted vote syndrome. This is the notion, and I know you've met these people. You talk to them about who they're going to vote for, and they say, well, I'm really attracted to candidate X from the Libertarian Party, but I don't want to waste my vote. And you say, what do you mean by that? They say, I got to vote. I want to vote for someone with a chance to win. They treat voting as if it's a $2 win ticket at the racetrack, like they're going to get something back for it if they vote for the right person. Or they'll say, well, it could be close. Could be close. Could come down to my vote, which is a piece of propaganda that they've been told over and over again. And they believe that their vote, their individual vote, is going to change the presidential election, which of course it will not. They might as well say, well, it's like a lot. I could win the Powerball. It's about on the same scale of possibility. It's extremely difficult to break that wasted vote syndrome. And we see that in polling. Libertarian candidates constantly poll much higher earlier on in the election season than they do towards the end. Now, there's some reasons for that related to money and expenditures and publicity, etc. But the main reason that's given for people changing their mind not to vote for libertarian candidates is they don't want to waste their vote. And when the closer they get to the voting booth, the more that affects them. And that's not going. This psychological phenomenon is not going away soon. So the critics say you're never going to win. They also say that the Libertarian Party taints the libertarian brand because occasionally we have weak candidates or ones that have funny antics that make everybody think that, this is a result of the fact that people are hypercritical, I think, of libertarian candidates. Remember in this last election, Gary Johnson had an interview where he didn't, he did not recognize the word Aleppo as referring to a city, but thought it was Aleppo, whatever Aleppo was. So, and there was a little confusion. That probably cost him hundreds of thousands of votes. I don't know about you, but I talked to a lot of people who said, I'm not voting for him, he didn't know where Aleppo was. Compare that to some of the crazy things Donald Trump said. I mean, it's not even, it doesn't hold a candle in terms of understanding or sophistication or intelligence or articulate, but that one, we're held to a very, very high standard. And any little thing goes wrong, you lose. Let me switch away from the criticism. There are other criticisms, but let me switch to the positive side. First of all, it is not true that Libertarian Party is a diversion of resources that, in fact, takes time away from other. The pie can be grown. You can support the Libertarian Party and do something else at the same time. You can walk and chew gum. You can write that book as well as running for office and supporting the party. People have a lot more time to support political activity than they otherwise think. And the party grows the pie by providing a practical, concrete activity for those who are freedom inclined. You know, what can I do? What can I do to change the course of human freedom? And I'm only one person, etc. Well, you can give $100 to this person's campaign, or you can put up some signs for them, or you yourself could run for office or whatever. And so it's much more concrete than other types of political activity. Also, the party, unlike other types of political activity like think tanks, etc., Libertarian Party appeals to the youth. You go to college campuses and people are thirsting for the libertarian message. And if you talk to people who are 18, 19, 20 years old, they have open minds. Sometimes I say wide open minds, but they're susceptible to anything they hear. So the Libertarian Party has the opportunity to go in and fill their minds with pro-freedom thoughts and give them something to do through activism. But also, and this is extremely serious, the party has the effect of pulling other politicians to libertarian positions because they feel the tug of those votes. They're afraid that they're going to lose votes to libertarians, so they pay lip service at least, and maybe sometimes even vote in a way that is a more libertarian position. That's an important and powerful role that the party plays. And you can see that in particular politicians, and I'm sure you all get your own examples of this, but I think that in fact the policies of the Libertarian Party on certain issues actually have significant effect on elected officials. They don't want to make, even though those libertarians are only 3 or 4% of the populace, they don't want to make them go away. So they at least pay them lip service, if not actually vote in ways that advances freedom. Also, although it's not the primary activity or purpose of the party, the Libertarian Party can be used for educational purposes. Candidates express ideas, and those ideas trigger response from people who are listening. And there's no better soapbox than being on a televised debate, or talking on the radio, or even going door to door and knocking on people's door and handing out pamphlets or whatever. You're having a positive educational effect. Even if you don't get the vote, you have injected the virus of freedom into everybody that you come in contact with. So it has a powerful, important role as spokespeople for liberty. Also, the party attracts media. Media is lazy. They have a lot of time to fill. And Libertarian Party candidates can get on the radio, they can get on the local television, etc. Much harder on the national level. It's particularly true now because we have so many different media channels. There's a million different ways to reach people thanks to the internet. And libertarians can fill up those channels with the ideas of liberty, and the party can do that. It's easier to get that interview if you say, I'm the Libertarian Party candidate for blankety blank, than if it is just saying, hey, I'm your local libertarian, let me on your radio station. So that actually is a cachet related to the candidacy. What are the future challenges for the party? Just to tick them off, the things that they've got to do. Candidates. Candidates have to be of high quality as well as of greater quantity. That's hard. That requires screening. It requires a lot of hard work to get good candidates. The schism within the party that exists in all parties, particularly the Libertarian Party, between purity and pragmatism has to be healed. And that's easy to say, difficult to do. We spend a lot of time fighting within the party between those two factions. In fact, it's much more powerful when they work together. And a more sophisticated electoral strategy has to be developed, what I call the barbell strategy. Lots of impact at the top, on the presidential candidates, and at the lower levels and the state levels of electing people to office. We can't foretell the future. People have free will. Is there going to come a time when everybody is all of a sudden going to be voting Libertarian? I don't know. But unexpected opportunities happen. The Berlin Wall does fall. The Republicans and Democrats do nominate people like Clinton and Trump simultaneously. And when these things occur, there has to be an electoral vehicle to take advantage of that to drive the message of liberty home. The Libertarian Party is the easiest vehicle for doing that because it already has that ballot status, it already has that name recognition, and it can be used for the purpose of advancing the cause of liberty. So, conclusion, I don't know where we go from here, but I believe that the Libertarian Party at least provides a vehicle that can advance the cause of liberty in the future, and I'd advise you all to at least consider becoming active in the party. Thank you.
The Honorable Judge John Buttrick, thank you very much, sir.